1969 from Woodstock. Maybe some folks in this audience went to Woodstock, I don't know. But often when we think about peace, images of the 1960s kind of come to the fore. The 1960s were a really seminal time for Americans. We acted on our passions to make really significant changes in the areas of social justice, in the areas of advocating for peace. When we think of peace, sometimes these images are what we conjure up. We think about the hippie culture or peaceniks. We think about freedom. We think about music. And that's all appropriate. But as our society has progressed, the images of peace have changed. And lately, what has happened is what were images of peacefulness in thinking about what peace means sometimes turn to violence. People who engage in non-violent civic action are people that work very hard to make sure that the people that they have working with them stay the course. But sometimes things go off the rails. Sometimes people are not trained in nonviolent civic action, and sometimes they're interlopers that show up and make changes that are unexpected. And be quite frank with you, recently sometimes there's heavy-handedness from law enforcement. This is from Ferguson in 2014, and this was the end of the day when the day started with peaceful protest. After the election in November, lots of high school students around the country were upset about the result. There were high school students who were also pleased with the result. I know in my own county, Montgomery County, Maryland, students got together and many of them walked out the day after or 2 days after school. In school that's very nearby, 100 students decided to walk out of school in protest of the election. There were also students that walked out in support of the election results. And the students had planned this to be a peaceful protest. They had permission from the principal, permission from the school board. But what ended up happening is when the two groups converged in front of the county courthouse, there was a fight. And it was the fight that became the news that evening. One student slugged another student. The students then came to me and some other of my colleagues who work with our city's Human Rights Commission and say, look, we need training. We need to be able to do this better. We need to be able to avoid this type of violence when it comes to engaging in nonviolent conflict. This is really important. What we're looking at here is we're thinking about how to go about make change. This is a photograph of Mahatma Gandhi. At the time, he was not Mahatma, he was Mohandas K. Gandhi. This is from 1909 when he was a polished, London-educated barrister still in South Africa. 5 years later, he would go to India and change the world. He would never look like this again, as you know. He would don the garbs of Indians and dress very modestly. One of the things that Gandhi said, which I want us to think about, is, as the means, so the end. What Gandhi was saying to us was, how we go about things reflects our morality of justice, our morality of honesty, our reality of truthfulness, our reality of peacefulness. We can't always, for sure, predict the outcome. But if we use the right means will often get us to the right ends. No one can argue the fact that we live in a violent society. We live in a society where violence permeates everything that we do. We live in a society where it's hard for us to get away from the violence that's all around us. It's hard for us to get away from the notion that guns are a way that people make decisions at times. It's part of our culture. And violence is something that even today was something that we dealt with in Washington when a member of Congress was shot. People who work for peace increasingly use the word peacebuilding to describe the work that they do. Peacebuilding is the process and the effort by which we look at means and we look at ends to reflect a society where human rights are respected, where a living wage is ensured, We're equality between people who have advantages and those that don't have advantages are evened out. Where social justice values are encouraged, where poverty is alleviated. Peace building envisions universal values of community, universal values of love, universal values of welfare. For 30 years, I spent my time working mostly with college and high school students in promoting peace and conflict resolution. I was very fortunate in my career when I was at a community college to go overseas as a U.S. Fulbright scholar. I went to Estonia, and I was fortunate because very few community college faculty have an opportunity to engage and participate in the Fulbright program. In my case, I took my whole family along. I think many of you might have gone on your own, but the advantages of taking your family along are probably fantastic in our case. My wife and I took our 3-year-old daughter and our 9-year-old son overseas, and I changed not only us, but it changed our children in very, very pronounced ways. I came back from that experience, and then I left my community college and started working in Washington, D.C. for the United States Institute of Peace. At the U.S. Institute of Peace, I spent most of my time traveling around the United States working with college students and college faculty to promote the teaching of peace and conflict resolution with them. Often I would be in a session with college students, and we would talk about peace, and we'd talk about social justice, and we would engage in activities and be very interactive and lots of fun and so forth. And then we'd have questions and answers. And the questions were always, how do I get a job working for peace? Sometimes they'd raise their hand and say, how can I get your job? And it wasn't always an easy question to answer, to be quite frank with you. It isn't easily identified. I've spent the last couple of years writing a book to try to answer some of those questions. But one of the things that I remind students is the way you go about doing things is the ability and is important to your ability to making peace around the world. The means, as the means, so the ends. It's really hard today to be a college student. College students have stress, right? It's the stress of peers. It's the stress of leaving home. Sometimes that's stressful on parents too, leaving home. I know I have a high school daughter who's going on to college, and my wife and I are grappling with her leaving home. And she's been on high stress since the first day of high school. But making decisions about sexual mores and avoiding drug use and the pressures from peers and choosing the right major, oh my gosh, is one thing after another. I'm waiting for her to deal with all of this. And often, maybe frequently, hanging over a student's head is this cloud of when I graduate, what will I do? And how am I going to pay off that average $40,000 debt? Some students it's $200,000. And it's due 6 months after you graduate. So for anybody here who just graduated, just to remind you, December is your first payment. College is also a time of exploration. It's a time when students start to find out about themselves, about their values, about what's important to them. They get that space to think and to dream. They get that space to be inspired by speakers and by each other. They get that space to kind of paint the perfect world, the world that they want to do, and that is really important also. Today, 1/3 of American workers are millennials, and by 2025, 75% will be millennials. So it's really important for us to know what are the values of millennials, how do they see the world, how do they operate in the world. Recently, the Intelligence Group did a study and found that 88% of millennials would rather engage in collaboration than competition to get things done. They'd rather collaborate than compete. It's very interesting because we seem to think we live in a society where competition is the be-all and end-all. And 64% of millennials say, I want to make positive change in the world. I want to make a difference in the world. That's really important. It's important when you think that after the election in November, surveys came out, and the one that I remember in particular was the Pew Research survey that said 86% of Americans think we are more divided than ever. more than divided than ever. It's a significant division in our country. Robert Putnam, in his 2000 book, Bowling Alone, talked about the fact that civic spaces in the United States have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. That going to PTA meetings or going to civic associations are not things that people do anymore. And as a result, the opportunities to discourse and to converse and to talk with people is not as present as they once were before. Dialogue is not complicated, but often we think about conversing with someone as a matter of beating them over the head with our point of view into submission so that they agree with us. That's not what it's about. It's about conversing with people to reach understanding, to open our hearts to what they're saying so that we ourselves can learn about what they're saying. This is what dialogue is all about. In 2014, August of 2014, I was invited to St. Louis Community College. And I was invited to the campus that's in Ferguson, Missouri. There's only one college in Ferguson, and it's a community college. And the community college is predominantly African American, like the city. And I was invited to come to spend time with faculty and students to work with them and to think about a plan moving forward of what the college could do. And so I spent 2 days meeting with students and faculty. And I remember the first day I had a meeting with a group of students. I don't even remember what happened at the meeting, but I had students from that campus, and then we brought students in from another campus that was a predominantly white campus to join them. St. Louis is pretty racially divided, so kind of northern part of St. Louis, African American, and southern part of St. Louis is mostly white. And I remember after the meeting, I was talking to a colleague, and I was peering out of the corner of my eye and watching another conversation going on. And there were two young women, probably about 18 years old, African-American young lady, a white young lady, and they're having a conversation. And the African young woman is explaining to her fellow student what's been going on in Ferguson, very intently telling her what's been going on. And the white student is asking questions. Very simple. But I will bet that they will not soon forget that conversation. But we don't have conversations like that. We don't have conversations that get into somebody else's space and learn about their sufferings and their traumas and their tribulations and what they're doing. People live in isolation, even going on college campuses. The next day, I met with a group of African American men who are part of a group called the African American Male Initiative. These were African American men who had come back to college and were in college in order to work, in order to make change in their community. And I remember having one conversation in particular with one young man who was 18 years old. And this 18-year-old man told me about an experience he had had previously, the week before, when he and his white girlfriend had been traveling in another part of St. Louis and had been pulled over by a police officer. And the police officer said to his white girlfriend, "Why are you dating him? You should be dating me." Talk about humiliation. What was important to me was not just the conversation itself, but what was important to me is having the conversation because, as you can see, I'm a white man of a certain age. And police brutality is not something that I've experienced. And what I hear about it, as I hear about it in the Washington Post or listen to it on the NewsHour. So having this conversation with somebody who's had this experience was very valuable to me. So talk about negotiation with students. This is also important to think about, that we negotiate all day long in the things that we do, in everything that we do. And I remind students that negotiation is something that's really valuable in how they go about their day. So I say to students, say you and your girlfriend or boyfriend want to go to the movies tomorrow night, and you want to go see Frozen, for the umpteenth time. That song, let it go, just can't let it go. Those of you who have kids know what I'm talking about. And your partner wants to go see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Anybody ever seen that? Okay. It's a cult movie in college. So you're thinking, oh, you could say, that's the end of our relationship, right? That's it. It's not probably what's going to happen. You're going to try to negotiate with each other to figure out the relationship. So what are you going to do? Maybe we'll find a movie that's a little bit like both of those two movies. Maybe. Or maybe what we'll do is we won't go out tonight. You go out with your friends and see that crazy Texas movie, and I'll go out and see Frozen again, right? Or maybe what you say is, We'll see your movie this week and my movie next week. In that case, I suggest seeing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre first and then Frozen. Whatever you're doing, you're negotiating. You're working with somebody to make change. This photograph here is a photograph that is from Collin College, which is north of Dallas, a group of students here. College students, some of them are internationals and some of them are domestic, and they're involved in something called the Welcome to America Club, where they welcome students to the United States and try to make them feel comfortable in coming to the United States. They're engaging in creating the sense of community. So the final means I want to talk about briefly is the idea of nonviolent civic action. I talked about that previously. Engaging with people of differences in a mass way to make change. We are seeing more and more of that going on today. And it doesn't have to be, it's obviously partisan, but regardless of what the partisan divide is, you can learn to do this. I recommend Gene Sharp's work to people who are thinking about doing this. This is actually a photograph of my daughter who's dealing with a lot of stress all the time at the Women's March in January. Martin Luther King, in 1963, was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama. Some of you may remember that. And when he was in the Birmingham jail, he wrote a famous letter from Birmingham jail. And he was writing the letter to the local Protestant clergy in Birmingham. And one of the things he said in the letter was, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community that has been constantly refusing to negotiate is forced to deal with the issue. As the means, so the ends. So getting people to think about engagement by means to create ends are very important. Last photograph, millennials. So we've been talking about millennials. This is my millennial son. And we've been talking about what they can do. Millennials bring a lot to the table, and they can offer a lot through their desire to collaborate and their desire to do the right thing. And we can learn from them in the means to the ends. My son is in Namibia right now, in another program that's important to what we do, and some of a program that many of you probably are familiar with, and that's the Peace Corps, right? In trying to do good work. Hopefully in our family, we've created a generation of peace builders that do that kind of work. So thank you very much.